Algae are some of the most fascinating organisms that we can find on Earth. The scientific study of algae is called phycology. You can also find the word algology, meaning the same thing, but frequently the scientists that study algae prefer phycology as a description or term used to describe their scientific discipline. We're going to find very diverse single-celled algae all the way up to multicellular algae that are very similar with a few exceptions to plants. And in fact, we're going to find that the classification of some of the major groups of algae are classified in what we call divisions. Divisions are large, diverse groups. We're going to find that the general characteristics of all algae will include that they are eukaryotic in cell structure. They can be both single, unicellular, or multicellular. They're photosynthetic, but the biggest difference between algae and what we would classify as plants, algae do not have any organized tissues or organs, even the very large ones. We're going to have examples of algae that look very much as if they should be classified as plants or in the kingdom Plantae, but when we take a very close look microscopically, we do not find any organized tissues or organs in any of the algae. It's been challenging to try and figure out in some examples or with certain species where to exactly classify them, and there are some very diverse, very interesting shapes, colors, and sizes in the different divisions. There are 7 divisions of algae that we want to learn a little bit about. Of the 7, there are actually 3 divisions that have the majority or the most prominently known or understood types of algae, and that would be Chlorophyta, Phaeophyta, and Rhodophyta, the green, brown, and red algae. That doesn't mean that the examples in the other 4 divisions aren't worthy of a little bit of our attention. It's just frequently the most abundant or the most predominant forms of algae are found in the green, brown, and reds. The green algae, or Chlorophyta, are the most plant-like. They use green pigments that we call chlorophylls to capture sunlight energy and use that sunlight energy in a process called photosynthesis. The chlorophylls that are used are called chlorophyll A and B, which are exactly like the chlorophylls we find in plants. We're going to see that for Chlorophyta, cellulose is used as cell wall material, which in fact is the same kind of cell wall material that we find in plants. Green algae can use carbohydrates as a storage molecule. We see the same type of, or very similar types of storage molecules in the form of carbohydrates in plants. But here we see some differences in cell structure and types of reproduction. Unicellular and single-celled, well, really, in truth, we don't find any single-celled plants. Plants are always going to be multicellular. So there's one significant difference. Now we do have multicellular green algae, but when we look at their detailed structure, we find there are no organized sexual reproductive structures, there are no organized organs or specific kinds of vessels for fluid movement. So we'd start to see some fundamental differences between the green algae and plants. There are forms of asexual and sexual reproduction, but when we look at the mechanisms of reproduction for the algae in comparison to plants, They're far more simple forms of reproduction in algae when we compare the complex structures that are formed during sexual reproduction in plants. We can asexually reproduce plants by grafting or cutting, but typically plants reproduce with the formation of seeds. And green algae don't have that kind of mechanism for sexual reproduction. Green algae are often freshwater species, and when we look at the photosynthetic pigments, in addition to chlorophyll A and B, which are the green colors, there are also what we call secondary photosynthetic pigments. The xanthophylls are the yellows, and the easiest way I suggest students remember that xanthophylls are yellow photosynthetic pigments is that xanthophyle is spelled with the letter Y, and so is the word yellow. The other secondary pigments are the carotenoids. And again, think of the word carrot, you think orange, and sure enough, carotenoids are the orange secondary photosynthetic pigments. When you combine all of these three colors, the greens, the yellows, and the orange, in various proportions, you'll find that some green algae are very bright green, and some are a little bit more sort of olive green, or they have some variation in intensity and hue of their colors in the green algae. Here we have an example of a green algae called Acetabularia. Commonly called the mermaid's wineglass, Acetabularia has been used many years ago now as a sort of experimental tool to determine where is the source of genetic material or genes inside of a cell. If you take a look at the picture of the person holding a little clump of Acetabularia, you can see how tiny these individual structures are. And in fact, the individual single structure where you have the little umbrella at the top, what we would call as a stem or a filament emerging from the underside of the little umbrella that goes all the way down to what we would call a holdfast, that whole structure is a single cell. So they're quite large and been very interesting as a research tool. The common name, again, mermaid's wineglass for Acetabularia, and the fact that Acetabularia was used is part of our historic research and years ago trying to determine where genes were located. Makes this a fascinating little green alga to work with. Here we have an example of a green algae that's making a dramatic effect in the Mediterranean Sea. Caulerpa taxifolia, also known as killer algae, is actually an escapee from an aquarium. Dumped offshore in the coastline around the Mediterranean, sort of between Spain and Italy, Caulerpa quickly began to establish itself on the coastlines, displacing and destroying native plants as it grew. It's apparently a fairly rapid grower, adapted easily to the growth conditions along the coastline, and as it turns out, apparently the fish and other animals that would typically eat the native plants don't like eating Caulerpa. So even the animals that were dependent upon other species of plants and algae that normally would grow were essentially starving to death because they really couldn't eat or wouldn't eat the Caulerpa. So here's an example of a single algae that is in the process of changing a whole environment over across the sea.